Welcome to the Table Podcast, where we discuss issues of God and culture, brought to you by Dallas Theological Seminary.
Welcome to the Table. We discuss issues of God and culture to show the relevance of theology to everyday life. I'm Darrell, Bock, Executive Director for Cultural Engagement at the Hendrick Center at Dallas Theological Seminary, and our topic today is IVF. Now, if you don't know what those initials mean, in vitro fertilization, which has become a topic of discussion, especially since the Southern Baptist resolution on IVF that was passed earlier this summer in June. And with me is Scott Ray, who, well, what is your current title, Scott? Because you've kind of shifted hats here.
Dean of Faculty and Professor of Christian Ethics at Talbot School of Theology, Biola University.
Very good. So he's speaking to us from the wonderful place of California, where you know they were shaking, rattling, and rolling here recently.
Didn't feel it. Didn't feel a thing.
I know you're a veteran Californian who goes, "Oh, that was just a little tickling of my toes." So
something like that.
Yeah. So Scott has done a lot of work in medical ethics and serves on, or did serve, I don't know if it's still current, on a couple of ethics commissions. I don't know what they're technically called in hospitals. And so he brings expertise. He's author of a book on moral choices, which has gone through 4 editions. Anything that goes through 4 editions means it's either very, very good or needed lots of correction. I'm not sure which. And so,
well, actually, I'm working on the 5th edition at the moment.
Well, congratulations.
Basically, what it means is that the field changes about every 5 years, and the stuff needs updating.
Yeah. Well, I was looking at the 4th edition today, and you know, it's such a helpful resource that I would commend it to anyone who listens to us and says, "Ooh, I would like to know more." So let's turn our attention to IVF. We did a podcast on IVF in general earlier, so we're coming back to the topic. But for people who don't know what IVF is and perhaps why it's a moral challenge to people, let's just start there with the basic question, and you can help us. So, what is IVF, and why is it such a topic for discussion?
Well, it's the most common, I think, reproductive technology used today for couples who are wrestling with the terrible ordeal of infertility. And I think that's sort of where you start on this. Is if you're one of those couples who's listening to this in the throes of wrestling with infertility, we feel your pain. It's for my wife and I had dealt with this. We had about a 4-year stretch of infertility. It was easily the most painful part of our 40 years of marriage. And nothing else has even come close to that. So it's the most common treatment used to deal with infertility. And it actually doesn't treat anything. It doesn't end run around it. And what they do is they use high-powered hormone treatments for the woman for about 30 days. They enable her to release as many eggs as possible in one cycle. Normally, she will release somewhere between 5 and 15 eggs. That's the norm. And then they are fertilized in vitro, in glass, literally, in a petri dish. And you see how many eggs successfully fertilized. Usually, the attrition rate is about half. So if they have 10 eggs, 5 will likely fertilize. And then they will implant some of those in the womb, usually not more than 2, maybe 3 sometimes, but that depends on other factors. And they will freeze the rest. And then if the first implantation is not successful, then they will go back and thaw out the remaining embryos and implant those. And it greatly helps reduce the cost, but also creates one of the main ethical dilemmas. Because if that first time is a win, and they have twins or triplets, chances are that their childbearing days are basically over, and they're left with the dilemma of what to do with these embryos that are in storage. And they have several options, none of which are considered ideal. they can discard them, or they can donate them to research, or they can donate them to another infertile couple, or they can implant them themselves.
Okay, so that was the quick walk through. Let me ask a couple of questions. Are they able, once the eggs are fertilized in vitro in glass, are they able to kind of, I don't know how to ask this exactly, grade the quality of what's been produced?
Yes, they do. They grade it on a scale of 1 to 3, 3 being excellent and 1 being unsuitable. For a variety of reasons. So it could be genetic abnormalities, it could be some other abnormality in the embryo. So yes, they grade them, and they only implant the ones that are of top quality, and they will encourage the couple to discard the others.
So, I mean, that adds a whole nother dimension to this, right?
Right. And there's, the freezing of embryos, I think, is another ethical issue, because if we believe that embryos are persons, I would never freeze my 2-year-old, no matter what the reason is.
Yeah.
We say that's something that say is intrinsically immoral. So that raises other questions.
So let me back up and let's do some biblical groundwork. I mean, the belief that many Christians have that God is responsible for the creation of life, and that personhood begins with conception, and then at the scientific level, everything that you need to have a child at a biological level comes with conception, which I think are the two base ideas that that inform the ethics of this conversation. The thing that strikes me in reading this, and I'm not, this is not an area I'm very familiar with, so I'm coming in as a total novice, is the idea that that an embryo by itself, detached from a womb, can be considered to be a life. Can you help us ethically sort through why that would be?
Yeah, because location does not make any philosophical difference to what kind of a thing an embryo is.
Okay.
And so it's just, whether it's in a petri dish or in a womb, is simply a change of location. And the fact that it can't flourish fully in a petri dish is irrelevant to that, because if I decided to send you to the moon, that's an environment that you can't flourish in, but that has nothing to do with your intrinsic value as a person. It's simply a change of location, and that location is morally neutral.
I see. So the idea of your being attached to a womb as being a basis for establishing at least the beginning of the nurturing of life isn't considered to be a moral factor in thinking through this.
No, because embryos are they are what they are based on what they are intrinsically. And you said it right just a second ago, that that single cell embryo has all the capacities that it will ever need to mature into a full-grown adult.
Yeah. I think one of the things that's confusing to people is the idea of you have everything that's intrinsic to life in that moment of conception on the one hand, and yet in one sense you can't advance that potential, if I'll say it that way, without the sustenance of the mother to bring that child to gestation. Fair enough?
I would put it a little differently.
Okay.
I would say that if it's not in the proper environment, there are certain capacities that are inherent to the embryo that are unable to be actualized. And so it can mature to a certain point, but not beyond that. And all that means is that the capacities that are inherent in the embryo cannot come to fruition. But the fact that capacities can't come to fruition that's no ontological comment on what kind of a thing the embryo is, because it's still, just because you can't bring capacities to actualization doesn't mean that you don't have them in the first place.
Okay.
It just means you're not in the right environment for those to come to fruition.
And it is the case that if you left an embryo in a petri dish to grow on its own, I don't know how else to say this, that it might exist for a time, but it would never go beyond that.
That's correct.
Okay.
But that's the same thing. I mean, if you left the newborn alone,
right,
you could say the same thing about a newborn. So the newborn. In fact, I would say that the degree of dependence on the womb is only slightly different between a 9-month-old fetus and a newborn child.
Okay. And the reason I'm walking through these various scenarios is because I think they raise some of the ethical distinctions that you have to think about in order to deal with the way people might raise responses to the circumstances that IVF generates.
Yeah, I agreed. And this is not a black and white issue. It requires a lot of nuance. In fact, I think some of the statements, say, the Catholic Church has made that completely rule it out. I don't think give it the kind of nuance that it needs. And I think the Southern Baptist statement that you referred to a little earlier, that's better, I think, at providing some of that nuance. But I think there's still room for some conversation.
Okay, so
about how that applies.
This is a nice setup for before we get to the details of the Southern Baptist resolution, which has generated our conversation. Let me go through and ask a question this way: if you were to list kind of the outstanding ethical issues or buckets that one would have to think about in thinking about IVF, what would that list look like?
All right. Number one, is it immoral to conceive a child outside the womb?
Okay.
So that's sort of basic. That's the because if the answer to that is yes, then this is a short conversation.
And that's the position of the Catholic Church, correct?
That is the Catholic view.
Okay.
Now, I will say some of our evangelical brothers and sisters are becoming more Catholic.
Uh-huh.
With regard to IVF and other reproductive technologies. But that's the intrinsic one. The other issues have to do with the procedure that's being used in IVF. Excuse me. So the second one would be the disposition of leftover embryos, if there are. The third one would be selective termination. If more pregnancies result than the woman is prepared to carry safely or desires to raise. The fourth one has to do with the freezing of embryos. And then the fifth one might have to do with if donor eggs or sperm are being brought into the arrangement, then or surrogates are being brought into it, then that raises questions about bringing third parties into the matrix of marriage for procreative purposes.
Okay, so no wonder you need nuance. You got 5 different issues that you got to deal with.
Yeah,
and
now, some of them are not that tough.
Okay.
So, for example, with the selective termination possibility, the couple can easily decide to take that one off the table just by limiting the number of embryos implanted to the number that she could safely carry.
Okay, so basically what you're saying there is there are no excess embryos on the other end of the process. Is that what you're saying?
Not really. This would happen if the thing's too successful.
Uh-huh.
And say you implant 4 embryos and all of them take.
I see what you're saying.
So not many women can carry 4 embryos to term safely.
Right.
So, but the couple can dispense with that quickly by just telling the clinic, no, we're only implanting 2 max.
I see. So that's the decision that's made on the front end, basically.
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
And this is all stuff, Darrell, what's so important about this conversation is that I think the average person in the church, they never hear about this.
Right, exactly.
And they're grossly undereducated in our churches on this.
Yeah. Well, that's why we're doing this, is to walk through the scenario. So let's go through the 5 one at a time, and let's do it this way because we're trying to respect how people view the judgments that have to be made as we walk through this. So let's go one at a time and lay out kind of the options that exist with each one, and then I'll let you express what you think the ethical preference is for each one as we go. So let's go one at a time.
Okay. the first one, I think, is the most basic one. And in my view, there's nothing intrinsically morally problematic about conceiving a child outside the womb.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason for that is that infertility, this is where I think the Southern Baptist statement could use a little bit more theological oomph to it in this area, that infertility, they acknowledge that infertility is painful and it affects couples who have good desires to bring kids into the world. But what they don't say is that infertility is the result of the general entrance of sin into the world. It was not the way God intended it to be.
Mm-hmm.
So as a result, it would seem that one of the legitimate goals of medicine would be to help alleviate the general effects of the entrance of sin, which I think some of the primary effects are disease, decay, and the dying process.
Mm-hmm.
So infertility is, I think, a result of the general entrance of sin, which I think makes it a legitimate arena for medicine to be involved in. So I don't think there's anything necessarily problematic about the technological fix for infertility. And even though somebody might come back and say, well, nothing's being fixed here, you're just doing an end run around the problem. But I would say that's not problematic either, because if that is, then we got lots of treatments and technologies that go out the window.
Yeah.
Like, kidney dialysis doesn't fix anything. It just does a complete end run around diseased kidneys.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that by itself that's not a deal breaker on that.
And does the discussion we had earlier about location also not come into this to some degree? And the issue is the embryo is the embryo, and whether it's in the womb or outside the womb, that is an entity. I mean, I get that you have an additional action that has produced the embryo, but still.
Yeah, the location makes no ontological difference.
Yeah.
As to what kind of a thing an embryo actually is. Mm-hmm. Now, here's what the Catholic teaching will say, and because they ground it differently. They don't go from what kind of a thing an embryo is. They go from what kind of a thing sexual relations are.
Okay.
And their view is that the unitive, which we would call the one flesh aspect of sex, and the procreative aspect always have to go together.
Okay.
And they can't be separated, which explains, in my view, why Catholics are just as adamant about birth control as they are about abortion. Because they're two sides of the same coin.
I see.
But I don't think the Scripture always mandates that those two things be separated. I think there are other ends for sexual relations besides procreation. Now, that's a key one, but it's not the only one. And so I think, take, for example, in the Song of Solomon. Song of Solomon celebrates just the beauty and the joy and the sort of the innate goodness of sexual relations in marriage. And there's not a word about procreation in there. It's simply a celebration of the goodness and beauty of sex. And I think what Paul's teaching in 1 Corinthians 7 at the beginning about how married couples should have regular sexual relations so that they're not tempted to fulfill those desires outside of marriage has nothing to do with procreation. It has to do with the value of sexual relations for marriage. And so I think, to put it, I think, in short, I don't think the Scripture mandates that the unitive and procreative aspects of sex always have to go together. And in fact, I think there's a time in which what I would call a God-ordained separation of those two things, and that is when a woman hits menopause.
Mm-hmm.
Because you can have all the procreative intention that you want, but unless we see a virgin birth equivalent, women are not going to get pregnant.
Yeah,
after
it ain't
menopause.
happening.
No.
Yeah.
And I think and most of us at our age are deeply grateful that that's not happening.
Mm-hmm.
So I think what I would say to my Catholic brothers and sisters is that's a natural law, God-ordained way of actually separating the unitive and procreative aspects of sex.
Okay.
So, but anyway, I think the first one, I don't see a problem with that per se.
Okay. So that moves us to the second category that you mentioned. I don't remember the order that you mentioned them in. I don't necessarily think we have to pursue them in the order you originally mentioned them in, but let's go to number 2.
And number two is the disposition of embryos that are left over.
Okay.
And this, I think what we need to distinguish is between the standard of practice in IVF clinics and other options that might be available to the couple if the clinic's willing to play ball with them.
Okay.
So the standard of practice is to create as many embryos as possible and store the rest. And the reason for that is almost strictly financial, because the beginning process of the hormone treatment for the woman to release as many eggs as possible in one cycle is the costliest part of IVF. I
see.
And so what they're trying to avoid is if they don't get enough embryos, then you got to start over. Mm-hmm. And it's the cost plus the wear. This is not easy on the woman's body either.
Yeah.
So it's just, it throws her system all out of whack to do this. In fact, the record that I've heard, the most eggs retrieved in one cycle was 60.
Wow.
That's 60. And I think that's 5 years worth in one cycle.
Yeah.
And so it's no wonder that this takes a huge toll on the woman's body. Now, what couples have to be committed to at the beginning to deal with this is they have to be committed to the notion that every embryo they create in the lab deserves implantation in the womb.
And again, it's because the embryo is seen as a genuine person,
as a full person. Yeah. Now, the people who really get this are the people who have had children through IVF and have embryos left over, because they know that there's continuity between those embryos in the petri dish and the bouncing children that they're holding in their arms.
Right.
They know that they're not two fundamentally different things. They are the same thing at this a different stage of maturity. Mm-hmm. And so that's why we don't use the terms that they develop into fetuses or they become fetuses. They mature into something that they already are. It's not like metamorphosis where they become something different than what they already are. So if couples are willing to make that commitment to implant all the embryos created, either themselves or putting them up for adoption to another infertile couple, I think you can be okay with this. Okay. Now I'm still not thrilled about freezing embryos, and that's a hurdle still you have to get over. But couples there are clinics that will taper back the hormone treatments that they do at the very beginning, so they don't release as many eggs as they could. And I've even heard of some clinic. This is not the norm at all, but who will do this one at a time. Now you're taking huge financial risks here to do that.
Because your odds are about what, 50-50 on a egg being produced. Embryo being produced from
an embryo successfully fertilizing.
Right.
That's about right.
Yeah.
But some couples actually, they'll go through all this and get nothing.
Yeah.
And then some hit the jackpot. So, but to take the average, that's about right. So that's the hard one. And I can't tell you, Darrell, how many couples I've talked to who don't think about this until they've got embryos in storage.
Yeah.
And then they realize, yikes, I'm in a world of trouble here.
Yeah.
Because they, say they've had twins or triplets, they're probably done. The woman may not be able to carry them again, but they don't like the idea of giving them up for adoption because that's different than putting one baby up for adoption. That's potentially 4, 5, 6 of your children that you're putting up for adoption. And that a lot of people don't have the stomach for that. And understandably so.
And so the issue is because the alternative is, and I take it this is what sometimes happens, is once you have the children that you want, the number of children that you want, the remaining embryos are destroyed.
That's one of the options, and that does happen fairly often. Actually, the most common thing that happens is couples will pay the storage fee.
Interesting.
And they'll keep paying it until one day they stop.
Yeah.
And that puts the clinic in a major quandary
As to what they do.
As to what they do then.
Yeah. Okay.
What it reflects is that the couple are, they're rightly, I think, totally ambivalent about destroying the embryos that they know are their children.
Right.
That's a hard one to ask them to do.
Right. Yeah. And just to be clear on this, what we're saying is these are the people who are concerned about this are people who have, for lack of a better description, a theological view of conception. Right? I mean,
correct.
If you're a religious nun, who doesn't have a theological, the way I describe a religious nun, they don't have any theological commitments. They don't have a theological bone in their body. They're not thinking about this. They're not concerned about it. But someone who has a Christian commitment sees God involved in the creation of life, et cetera. It becomes a very important and even central, one of the most basic questions you can answer.
It is. It's a crucial question. And the average couple who goes through IVF goes in without having their eyes open to this.
Flying blind.
Because the clinic's not going to tell them.
Yeah.
And if the clinic's not going to tell them, and our churches are not talking, well, where are they going to hear this?
Yeah. Yeah.
No, they're not.
Yeah. Okay, number 3.
Selective termination.
Okay.
That one we've already fixed.
Okay.
Because you just limit the number of embryos implanted to the number that you can safely carry.
Okay.
And even if I were pro-choice, I would still think it'd be really callous to go to this length to create all these embryos and then selectively terminate some just because you got pregnant with more than you wanted.
Yeah.
And that just strikes me as really callous toward life.
Yeah. Yeah. So start off on the right foot. Is that kind of what we're saying?
Well, yeah. Start off. Come in with your eyes open.
Yeah.
And if you don't have the stomach to do it the right way, then don't do it.
Yeah. Yeah.
But Darrell, you'd be surprised how many couples I talk to who I will tell them about the ethical issue, and they will look me right in the eye and say, "I don't care about those."
Yeah.
Because all we want is a child, and the ends justify the means.
Yeah, yeah. Well, there's a lot of ends justifies the means in the world.
And we say, unfortunately, they don't.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Okay, so number 4.
Freezing embryos.
Okay.
This is the part I'm really uncomfortable with this, and I think because that is where I think the Southern Baptist statement is right, and our Catholic friends are right. That freezing embryos is intrinsically dehumanizing because it treats them as a product and not a person. That's not something we would ever do to a person, regardless. To a person outside the womb, regardless of what the reasons are. We would just say that's just something you don't do. But that is the standard of practice. So in infertility clinics.
Let me ask this question. It comes to mind as we're talking about this particular example, and that is, I think about people who get an operation who are put to sleep, so they don't feel the pain, that kind of the kind of alteration. So isn't part of the ethical dilemma the decision about what you do, if I can say it this way, coming out of the freezing as much as the freezing itself, or not?
It is. It is, because there's some debate over the likelihood of attrition in thawing out embryos.
I see.
And because clearly some don't make it.
Yeah.
The reason they don't make it is what's up for debate.
Okay.
Is whether there's something intrinsic to freezing and thawing, or the reason they don't make it. My obstetrician told us some time ago that the reason frozen embryos don't thaw out successfully is usually because there's some sort of genetic abnormality, and if they don't thaw successfully, then they won't implant successfully.
Interesting.
So I'm not so sure about that.
Yeah, that's convenient in some ways.
Yeah, I have great respect for our OB.
Yeah.
But I think there's probably something that's intrinsic to freezing and thawing. That's not what's intended to happen, and it doesn't kill the embryo. It just dramatically slows down all of the metabolic processes that the embryo is going through in order to have cells divide and to grow and mature.
Right. So, okay, so that's
a problem.
That's the challenging one, if I can say it that way.
It is.
Yeah.
And I think the only way out of it is to tell the clinic from the start, no leftover embryos. And that either involves, one at a time, or what's called minimal stimulation, IVF, where they only stimulate the ovaries enough to produce a handful of eggs. That's the only way around that. Financial risk to that is off the charts. Mm-hmm. And the clinic will look at you like you've lost your mind. But I think for the couple, you have to tell the clinic what your values are up front. And if this is really important to the couple, which it ought to be, they've got to tell the clinic. And this is where we tell couples that, you need to keep in mind that these infertility clinics are, sometimes they advertise themselves as giving people the gift of life, which is an overblown claim to begin with.
Yeah, right.
But they are fundamentally a business. Mm-hmm. And if they're not respecting your values, I think, take your ball and go home. Go somewhere else.
Yeah. Okay, so number 5.
This is embryo adoption, which I think is a good option, both for couples trying to get pregnant and for couples with leftover embryos. So we'll take the latter of those first. There are, I would have your viewers and listeners Google the Snowflake program, which is the first and largest embryo adoption agency in the world. It's headquartered just a few minutes from where Biola is in Southern California, and they've facilitated hundreds of embryo adoptions, and they do it the right way. It's actually an adoption procedure that's recognized by law. Sometimes the clinics will sell you the embryos and not bother with the adoption process. And although that's probably pretty safe, because the couples who put the embryos up for adoption probably are not going to come back and reclaim their children,
right?
Like traditional adopted mothers sometimes do.
Yeah.
And I think it's actually a good option for couples who are considering adoption, because it gives you a number of things that are normally really important to the couple and can be important to the child. For one, the woman gets the experience of pregnancy and childbirth, which is really important to a lot of women. But there's continuity between the mother who gestates the child and the mother who rears the child. There's no break in the relationship that happens in traditional adoption. So I think there's a lot of merit to embryo adoption. There are over 1 million embryos in storage in clinics around the country today, and to rescue some of those, I think I would call that that's not procreation. It's adoption is a rescue operation that is different from procreation. I would distinguish between those two.
And so it's a good alternative to what God has to be the remaining option, which is destroying the embryo.
Yeah, or donating to research, which does the same thing.
Okay, so actually we haven't raised that dimension of this yet at all, so that's probably worth noting now, which is what happens with the remaining embryos is either they terminate, right, or they're used for research, or they find another home, if I can say it that way.
Basically, that's right.
Yeah.
And so either the research will either kill the embryo or they'll be discarded after the research is done.
Right, which has always been another element that's made some of the discussion of IVF controversial, because you still have this problem of what happens with an embryo that doesn't end up becoming a child.
That's correct.
Yeah,
and most of the options are really problematic. Mm-hmm. The easy options are morally really challenging. Mm-hmm. And this is why couples they got to know what they're getting into before they get into it.
By easy option, you mean just simply, for like not caring about the result, or is that what
basically?
Yeah.
It's just it doesn't cost anything. You kind of forget about it and move on. Quote quote move on.
Yeah.
I'm not quite sure how you move on from that entirely, but it's a much easier decision than the decision to implant them yourself.
Yeah.
Or to donate them to another couple. I had a couple in my office not too long ago that they had 2 different rounds of IVF and had twins both times, and had embryos left over, and they did not want any more children, but they were really torn about what to do because they thought implanting them themselves, we're able to implant them ourselves. It's the right thing to do, and so they did, and they had another set of twins.
Oh wow!
And so at the time I talked to them, they were looking at the option of, having 6 kids under the age of 5 running around their house, which is a, sort of wild and crazy environment. But I'm convinced they did the right thing, and so are they. But I think the only thing challenging about embryo adoption, and some of the Catholic critics have mentioned this, is that sometimes if that functions as a safety net for couples to produce as many embryos as they can to get the best success rate for themselves, it sometimes fosters what I think is a cavalier attitude toward creating embryos in the lab. And that's a problem. We should be much more judicious about how we do this, because I'm delighted that embryo adoption is available, but using it as a safety net and going on with a standard of practice, I still think is problematic.
Okay, well, that walks us through the territory and the options.
Is that clear as mud?
Yeah, that's good, and it shows the complexity and why nuance is important. So let's turn our attention to the Southern Baptist Resolution per se. You say you have a copy, so why don't you read that to people? Hopefully, it'll make more sense having walked through our options.
It's actually too long to read on the air like this.
Okay.
I would encourage your listeners to get access to it. You just Google SBC IVF. Will get you there.
Okay.
But here, I'll highlight a couple of things.
Yeah, the key components.
Where they start.
Yeah.
Is they start with the personhood of the embryo. So whereas every human being is made in God's image, and is thus to be respected and protected from the moment of fertilization until natural death without regard to developmental stage or location. I think they've said that exactly right. And it says, whereas human beings possess an inherent right to life, an opportunity to reach to full developmental maturity. And then here's the part that I'm just not so sure how to read. Whereas biblical creation order portrays the embodied union of husband and wife as the singular normative expression for procreation. And that sounds like a really Catholic view of this.
Yeah.
And I think what I'd want to make sure people understood is that there's a reason why the creation order portrayed that embodied union as the norm for procreation. That's because it was the only option on the planet at the time. Right? There was no opportunity to do anything else. The only option was the embodied union of the husband and a surrogate. Okay, but procreation, it was not possible in biblical time for procreation to happen outside of normal sexual relations. In
other words, IVF couldn't happen.
Well, it was not even. Nobody's radar screen.
Yeah.
At that time, and I'm leery of reading too much into an argument from silence like that. So that's the part that I'm not so sure about, because they say a little bit later on that resolved. We affirm that all children, no matter the circumstances of their conception, are gifts from God and loved by Him. Which sounds like there may be nothing intrinsically problematic about where a child is conceived. And I mean, if that's the way I want to read that, then I think that's fine. But I'm not convinced that the Catholic requirement that all procreation take place within the realm, within normal sexual relations in marriage is biblically required.
Okay.
I do think it's required that procreation take place within the general sphere of marriage. That's true. I think the Bible's really clear about that there's clear continuity between marriage, procreation, and parenting, that those are all supposed to go together. Unless, of course, that the one of the parents is unfit, or there are a handful of other exceptions to that. But I think they get a lot of things right. It says, whereas the IVF process routinely generates more embryos that can be safely implanted, thus resulting in continued freezing, stockpiling, and ultimate destruction of human embryos. I think that's true. So there, I think there's a lot of good in this. They resolved to continue to promote adoption. They resolved to grieve alongside couples. They resolved to commend couples to do this in ways consistent with the dignity of the embryo. That's all. I think that's right. Those are all good things. Now, I think what I hope is helpful to your listeners is we've tried to spell out a little bit more what that involves,
right,
in more detail.
So that spills over into, for lack of a better description, the debate about legally how to think about this. And of course, it was an Alabama Supreme Court decision, I guess, recognizing the viability and the humanity of the embryo on its own terms that triggered all this.
Correct.
So, and by everything that we've set up to that point, that decision, at least viewed theologically, makes sense.
I think, yeah, I would be supportive of that decision.
Yeah.
To recognize, because we recognize the right to life of full persons. The 14th Amendment to the Constitution, recognizes that human beings can't be bought and sold. We've extended that to newborns. We've extended that to adoptable children. We've extended that to fetuses, because we don't buy and sell their body parts as a norm. Theologically, there's no good reason not to extend that to embryos.
Okay. So and that comes from where we started, which is that when you have an embryo, you have everything necessary to mature to life.
I'd say to adulthood.
Okay.
Because it already is life.
Life, fair enough.
Yeah. And this is where embryologists will tell you that from conception, it's a living human being.
Yeah. Yeah. I remember, when we were, as you know, I serve on the board of Wheaton, and we were part of a litigation in this regard, trying to seek protections for the theological way we see this space in relationship to healthcare provisions and that kind of thing. And I remember
we were a party to that lawsuit too.
Okay, and we actually were in conversations with our scientists about this, and they, that's where I first heard the principle that everything that's necessary for growth to adulthood it resides in the embryo from the moment of conception.
That's correct. There's an argument to be made that the very first cell, in some respects, could be the most complicated cell in the whole body.
Yeah, yeah, because of all the potential that resides within it.
That's all the capacities that have yet to be actualized.
Yeah. So all this is interesting. Of course, we function in an environment. This is the hard part of this. The hard part of this is we function in an environment where not everyone possesses the same worldview. And so that's where our tensions come from. And I tell people that if someone doesn't have a theological orientation and a category for this, then what we are contending for in the public square is hard for them to process because they don't have the categories for it.
Right.
That doesn't make their perception right, but it is worth being aware of why you have the kind of conversations that you do.
Well, and I think what it means is that we have to be able to craft an argument that is consistent with our theological convictions, but not explicitly dependent on them.
Yeah. To
make sense of this in the public square.
Yeah. No, this is something I talk about all the time. And because you want to talk about why life ought to function this way, almost regardless of your view. And what the nature of this thing is, which is why the science part of it is important, because the science part is telling you what you're actually dealing with.
That's correct. Although the science needs to be supplemented by philosophy and theology.
Okay.
Because not everybody identifies a human being and a human person as the same thing. Okay. And it's very common for people to say that fetuses are human beings, but they're not yet persons. And at the end of life, it's very common to say people are still human beings, but they are no longer persons. And those categories that define a person are things like, rationality, self-consciousness, capacity for relationships, the things that give life its texture and a lot of its meaning. The problem with those categories is that there are a number of counterexamples that I think sort of lay waste to that distinction, because someone under general anesthesia has the ability to exhibit none of those capacities, at least if the anesthesia is being done correctly. But when they wake up, that's all.
Voila, it's
gone.
back again.
I'm back. Yeah. And so, for someone to say, well, that's just an exception to the general rule. Of course, while they're under anesthesia, they're still a person. But what they're doing there is they are obviously appealing to something else besides those capacities. To say that person under anesthesia is still a full person. Yeah. And so you can't have it both ways on that. And so I think we would say that because embryos are and fetuses and newborns and adults, because human beings are a certain kind of thing, they exhibit certain traits. But the traits don't make you a person, right? The traits fall out of who we are as human persons.
Yeah, and
they don't determine. That's a really important distinction to make sure we don't get the philosophical cart before the horse.
Yeah, and so you're speaking philosophically now, and then of course theologically, what we do is we say what makes a person. I think in part is they're made in the image of God.
True, but that sort of begs the question of, who should be included in that category of being made in the image of God. And I think some of the say the gospel accounts in Luke 1 and 2, I think suggest that fetuses from the very earliest stage of maturity were considered their image of God bearing persons.
I find the passage, and I think it's interesting you brought this up. I find the passage where John the Baptist leaps in the womb when Mary shows up as being an example of what you just described.
I think that's right. And I think some translations in Psalm 139, where it talks about having been fashioned in the secret place, the womb being reserved as a place of protection. There are places where sometimes that term for the unborn, the unformed substance is the way I think the NIV renders it. There's some that translate that as embryo. I wouldn't go to the stake for that, but I think that's not an unreasonable translation of that. And the point I think they're making is from the earliest stages of pregnancy, you have someone who is being fashioned and molded and formed intricately by God in the womb. and has all of the all the marks of being a full person.
And the psalmist is seeing that as part of his personal history.
Yes, and continuity between those different time periods.
Right. Yeah. Well, Scott, I want to thank you for taking the time to walk us through all this and allow us to kind of take a second look at IVF together, and with these particular questions in mind. I think we've not only talked about what it is, but the implications of it, both in terms of the way the church sees it and then in its legal context. So I really appreciate you taking the time to do this with us.
Yeah, my pleasure. Just I think a final word to, if you have pastors or church leaders,
yeah, sure,
who are listening, be sure that you are doing something to help educate the people in your congregations about some of the things that they will face, decisions they'll have to make when contemplating IVF. Because one in six, Darrell, couples of childbearing age are technically infertile. And there are a lot of folks out there, and they are in our pews Sunday after Sunday.
Wow.
And they need to hear what they are considering, and for pastors and church leaders to be helpful guides along the way.
Well, thank you for the time. Really do appreciate it. And I want to thank you, our listeners, for being with us. If you like the show, please leave a rating or a review so that others can find out about us. And we hope you'll be with us again the next time when we discuss issues of God and culture to show the relevance of theology to everyday life. Thank you for being a part of the table today.
Thanks for listening to the Table Podcast. Dallas Theological Seminary. Teach truth, love well.